He gave a native girl her first mirror. Because of this, they surrounded his cabin. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. In the heart of the American West, where the vast plains stretch under a blistering sun and rugged mountains stand as silent sentinels, there lived a man named Ethan. Ethan was a rancher, a solitary soul who had inherited a small, weathered cabin from his late father. His life had been simple, tending to his cattle, fixing fences, and rarely venturing beyond his property. He had always preferred the company of his horses to people, as the land provided him everything he needed. He had seen many people come and go, but he had never truly connected with anyone. The world was a lonely place for Ethan, but that was just how he liked it. One day, as the sun dipped low in the sky and the air grew cooler, Ethan was making his way back to his cabin after a long day of herding cattle. His boots kicked up the dust as he walked, and the rhythmic sound of hooves accompanied him. But as he approached the familiar path leading to his home, he noticed something strange, a figure standing at the edge of his property. It was a young native girl, her clothes ragged and her eyes wide with uncertainty. She looked out of place, and yet there was something in her gaze that seemed familiar, almost as though she was seeking something. Ethan stopped in his tracks, unsure of what to do. He had never had much interaction with the native tribes in the area, but he knew enough to understand that they lived by their own set of rules. As the girl saw him, her eyes softened, and she took a tentative step toward him. Ethan didn't move, watching her carefully. She appeared to be lost, with no sign of a family or group nearby. Ethan's heart softened for a moment. Despite his hardened exterior, he couldn't bear to see someone in need without offering help. He approached her slowly, not wanting to alarm her. "Are you okay?" he asked in a gentle voice, his eyes scanning the girl for any signs of injury. The girl didn't respond at first, only looked down at the ground. Then, after a moment, she raised her head and spoke in a language Ethan didn't understand. He frowned, not knowing what to do, but then he realized he might have something that could help. Ethan had a few old items in his cabin, things he had inherited from his father, things that he rarely used. Among them was a small mirror, an item that had once belonged to his mother, who had passed away when he was just a boy. Ethan had never thought much of it, but now, seeing the girl's confusion and helplessness, he felt a strange urge to offer it to her. He took the mirror from his cabin and approached the girl, holding it out to her. "This is for you," he said simply. The girl looked at the mirror in his hand, then back at him, her expression unreadable. Slowly, she reached out and took it from him, her fingers brushing against his. As she held the mirror in her hands, something incredible happened. Her eyes widened in disbelief as she saw her reflection for the first time. The girl stared at the mirror, transfixed, as if seeing herself for the first time. It was a moment of pure wonder, a moment of connection that neither of them had expected. The world around them seemed to fall away, and in that instant, they shared something unspoken. But just as quickly as the moment had arrived, it was gone. The girl turned and hurried off into the woods, disappearing as quickly as she had come. Ethan stood there, staring at the spot where she had been, his heart racing with a strange sense of anticipation. He had no idea what that moment meant, but he felt it deep inside him. He couldn't explain it, but somehow, he knew that this simple act of kindness had set something in motion, something he wasn't prepared for. The next morning, as Ethan was finishing his breakfast, he heard the sound of hooves approaching. He stepped outside, squinting against the rising sun, and saw a group of figures in the distance. His heart skipped a beat. There, riding toward his cabin, were dozens of native warriors, their faces painted with intricate designs, their expressions serious. They moved in perfect formation, like a force of nature. Ethan's stomach dropped. His first instinct was to run, to hide, but something told him to stand his ground. They were coming for him, but why? His thoughts raced as the warriors approached, their horses kicking up dust in the morning light. He stood there, waiting, not knowing what would happen next. He could feel his pulse quicken as they drew closer. He thought of the girl, of the mirror, and of the strange connection they had shared. Had it all led to this? Was it truly just a simple act of kindness that had brought them here? The warriors arrived in silence, their horses moving with the precision of an army. Ethan stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. The morning air was thick with tension as the riders drew closer. His mind raced with questions. Why were they here, and what did they want? He had never been in a situation like this before. The girl, who had been so grateful for the mirror, had vanished into the woods the night before. But now, the appearance of these warriors, their painted faces and stern expressions, made everything feel surreal. Ethan could feel the weight of the situation, as if the very earth beneath his feet had shifted. He knew, deep down, that this was no ordinary visit. The group stopped just a few yards from him, and the leader, a tall man with long black hair and a deep scar across his cheek, dismounted. Ethan's instincts told him to stay calm, to stand his ground, but his mind was racing. The warrior approached slowly, his eyes never leaving Ethan's. He spoke in a language that Ethan didn't understand, his voice low and commanding. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The words were foreign, but the tone was unmistakable. This was not a conversation, it was a demand. The warrior pointed toward the cabin, and Ethan hesitated, unsure of what was being asked of him. He had no idea what was going on, but he could feel the power emanating from the group. This was no random encounter. This was something important. The leader gestured for Ethan to follow him, and after a moment's hesitation, he did. The warriors flanked him as they made their way toward the cabin. The air seemed to grow heavier with each step, and Ethan couldn't help but feel a strange sense of foreboding. What had he done to deserve this? He glanced back at the group, noticing the warriors' watchful eyes. They weren't just here for a visit. They were here for something much bigger. When they reached the cabin, the leader turned to him and spoke again, his voice now softer but no less serious. Ethan still couldn't understand the words, but the tone made it clear that something significant was about to happen. The leader handed Ethan a small bundle wrapped in leather. Ethan took it carefully, unsure of its contents. When he unwrapped the bundle, he found a small pouch, much like the one the girl had carried the day before. The same pouch that had contained the strange steam. The same pouch that had been so important to the warriors. Inside, Ethan found a piece of cloth, a deep crimson red, with intricate patterns sewn into it. The leader watched him closely as he held it in his hands. There was something in the man's eyes, something that spoke of ancient traditions, of a bond that transcended time. Ethan's mind spun as he tried to make sense of everything. The girl, the mirror, the pouch, and now this cloth. It was all connected, but how? The leader finally spoke again, his words slow and deliberate. Ethan still couldn't understand, but something in the man's tone made it clear. This was a test of his honor, his courage, and his understanding of what had happened. Ethan nodded, though he still had no idea what was expected of him. The warriors stepped back, forming a circle around him, their faces unreadable. The leader gave a slight nod, and the warriors raised their weapons in unison, their movements synchronized and precise. Ethan's heart raced as the tension in the air became almost unbearable. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew that he had been thrust into something far beyond his understanding. The warriors stood silent, waiting for something. Ethan held the cloth tightly in his hands, feeling the weight of it, as if it were a key to something unknown. The leader stepped forward again, his eyes locked on Ethan's. And then, in a voice that carried the weight of centuries, he spoke the words that would change everything. Ethan didn't understand the language, but the meaning was clear. This was no ordinary meeting. This was the beginning of a new chapter, one that would define Ethan's place in the world. The warriors lowered their weapons, and for the first time, Ethan felt a sense of calm wash over him. The girl's reflection in the mirror had triggered something, a shift in fate. And now, he was part of something much larger than himself. The warriors stood silently around Ethan, the air thick with anticipation. The leader, whose eyes had never left him, took a step forward and motioned for Ethan to follow him. Without a word, Ethan obeyed, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him like a heavy cloak. The warriors parted, allowing him to pass through the circle they had formed, their eyes still watching him with an intensity that made his heart race. They moved with purpose, guiding Ethan toward the edge of the clearing where a large rock formation jutted out from the earth. The leader walked beside him, not speaking but exuding a quiet authority. As they reached the base of the rock, the leader stopped and turned to face Ethan. With a stern look, he gestured for Ethan to sit, which he did without hesitation. The warriors spread out, standing like sentinels, their presence both imposing and solemn. Ethan's mind swirled with confusion. What was happening? Why had these warriors come for him? And what was the significance of the mirror, the cloth, and the girl? The leader sat across from him, the distance between them still thick with unspoken words. Then, without warning, the leader spoke. Ethan didn't understand the language, but the tone, the cadence of the words, felt important, like an ancient ritual being performed. The leader's words carried an air of authority, and Ethan couldn't help but feel that they were meant to convey something deep, something that transcended mere words. After a long pause, the leader handed Ethan a small pouch, similar to the one the girl had carried. It was old, the leather worn from years of use, but it still held a sense of importance. Ethan looked at it, then back at the leader, who nodded slightly, as if urging him to open it. Hesitantly, Ethan untied the pouch and peered inside. Inside there was a small, intricately carved stone, cold to the touch. It was smooth and worn, but its shape seemed to hold some significance. Ethan held it in his palm, feeling its weight and texture, but it didn't make sense to him. Why had they given him this stone? What did it mean? The leader watched him closely, his gaze steady, his expression unreadable. Slowly, the leader began to speak again, his voice softer this time. Ethan didn't understand the words, but he felt the sincerity behind them. There was something almost spiritual about the way the leader spoke, as if he was entrusting Ethan with something sacred. The warriors remained silent, their expressions stoic, but there was a shift in the atmosphere, a sense of expectation hanging in the air. The leader gestured toward the stone, and then toward the sky, as if indicating a connection between the two. Ethan felt a stir of realization, but it was fleeting, like a dream he couldn't quite grasp. He looked down at the stone in his hand, and, for a brief moment, he felt an odd warmth emanating from it, a warmth that seemed to radiate from deep within the earth itself. The leader stood and motioned for Ethan to follow him. Without a word, Ethan rose and walked behind him, the stone still clutched tightly in his hand. The warriors moved with them, flanking them as they walked toward a hidden alcove in the rock formation. Ethan felt a strange sense of purpose as they moved, as if this path had been laid out for him long before he had even known it. They reached the alcove, and the leader pointed to a small opening in the rock. Ethan understood immediately. This was the moment he had been waiting for, though he didn't fully understand why. He stepped forward, holding the stone in his hand, and placed it carefully into a small indentation in the rock. As soon as the stone touched the rock, there was a soft, almost imperceptible hum, and the ground beneath Ethan's feet seemed to shift. The air around him grew warmer, the wind died down, and the warriors watched in silence. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the rock in front of him began to glow faintly, a soft, pulsing light that seemed to come from deep within. Ethan stood frozen, watching in awe as the light grew brighter. The leader stepped forward, his face unreadable, but Ethan could see a flicker of something in his eyes, pride, perhaps, or recognition. The light continued to pulse, and for the first time, Ethan felt as though he were standing on the edge of something vast, something beyond his understanding. It was as if the earth itself was alive, responding to the stone he had placed in its heart. The warriors stood still, their expressions unchanged, but Ethan could feel their eyes on him, their anticipation growing. And then, as the light reached its peak, the leader spoke once more, his voice a low murmur that seemed to reverberate through the very air. Ethan didn't understand the words, but somehow, he knew they were a command, a declaration. The warriors bowed their heads in unison, and the leader stepped back, his eyes never leaving Ethan. Ethan stood there, the glowing rock in front of him, the weight of the moment settling on him like a heavy burden. He had no idea what would come next, but he knew that whatever it was, it would change everything. This was only the beginning. As the light from the stone faded, Ethan stood in stunned silence, still processing what had just happened. The rock in front of him was now dull, its faint glow dissipating, but something had changed. He felt it deep within his bones, like an ancient connection being made. The air around him seemed to hum with energy, and the warriors, who had been motionless, now looked at him with something different in their eyes. It wasn't fear or distrust. No, it was respect. The leader stepped forward, his eyes still locked on Ethan, and nodded slowly. For the first time, Ethan felt as if he were being seen, truly seen, by those who had surrounded him. The leader did not speak, but his gesture was clear. It was time to move forward. Ethan's heart raced as he followed the leader back toward the clearing where the warriors had gathered. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if he was walking towards something inevitable. The warriors parted, creating a clear path for him. Ethan walked with the leader, the warriors following closely behind, their movements synchronized like a well-oiled machine. He glanced back over his shoulder at the rock, now just an ordinary formation in the landscape, but the events that had just transpired felt anything but ordinary. He had somehow become a part of something much larger than himself. The girl, the mirror, the stone, all of it seemed to have led him here. But to what end? What did it mean? As they reached the center of the clearing, the leader stopped and turned to face Ethan once more. This time, the leader's expression was softer, though his eyes still held that same intensity. Without saying a word, he reached out and placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, a gesture of reassurance, or perhaps guidance. Ethan felt the weight of the moment settle over him. He had no idea what was about to happen, but he knew that his life had changed forever. The warriors around him shifted, and the air seemed to grow still. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath. Then, without a sound, a figure emerged from the shadows at the edge of the clearing. It was the girl. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he saw her step forward, her eyes meeting his. She was no longer the frightened, lost girl he had first encountered. No, she stood tall now, her presence commanding, as if she had always known her place in the world. Her eyes, once filled with uncertainty, were now full of purpose. She walked toward Ethan, her steps measured and deliberate. As she reached him, she stopped and held his gaze for a moment before speaking. Her voice was clear, confident, and strangely familiar. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he listened, even though he still couldn't understand the words. But the meaning of her words wasn't lost on him. It wasn't the language that mattered. It was the emotion behind it, the weight of her message. The girl reached into the folds of her cloak and pulled out a small object, wrapped in cloth. She handed it to Ethan, and as his fingers brushed against the cloth, he felt a strange sense of recognition. It was the same pouch, the same one that had been given to him earlier. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a small, beautifully carved wooden figurine. It was of a woman, strong and graceful, with features that seemed to mirror the girl's own. It was a symbol of something ancient, something that Ethan couldn't quite grasp, but it resonated deep within him. The girl spoke again, her words soft yet powerful, and for a moment, Ethan felt the weight of her message settle into his chest. The figurine wasn't just a gift, it was a key to something beyond what he had known, beyond the world he had lived in all these years. The warriors around him shifted once again, their attention focused on the girl. It was clear now. This was her moment, her time to speak. The leader stepped back, allowing her to take center stage. Ethan watched as the girl raised her hands, and the warriors responded in kind, raising their weapons in a silent show of respect. The clearing fell silent, and in that silence, Ethan felt the enormity of what was unfolding. This wasn't just about him. It was about something much larger, something that spanned generations. The girl lowered her hands, and the warriors lowered their weapons. The tension in the air lifted, but the weight of the moment lingered. Ethan stood there, unsure of what to say or do. But as the girl met his gaze once more, he knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. The girl spoke again, and this time, her words were for him. Ethan didn't understand them, but somehow, he knew what she was saying. It was a call to action, a call to step into a world he had never known but had always been a part of. He had been chosen, whether he understood it or not. And as the warriors turned to leave, the girl's eyes never left his. She nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of what had just passed between them. Ethan's heart raced as he watched the warriors disappear into the distance, leaving him standing alone in the clearing. But he wasn't truly alone. He felt the presence of something larger than himself, something that had been waiting for him. And in that moment, Ethan knew that his life would never be the same. As the last of the warriors faded into the distance, Ethan stood motionless in the clearing, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The girl's gaze had never left him, and even now, with the sound of the warrior's departure fading into the wind, he felt her presence lingering. It was as if the very air had shifted, as if the land itself had embraced him, accepting him into something greater. Ethan turned slowly, his mind racing to understand the meaning of the events that had unfolded. What had he just experienced? The stone, the figurine, the girl. Their significance seemed too great, too ancient for him to comprehend. He had lived his life in isolation, never truly belonging to the world around him. But now, it felt as though the world had found him. The mirror, the pouch, the figurine, it was all part of something larger than he could have imagined. Ethan slowly made his way back to his cabin, his heart heavy with the questions that weighed on his mind. He had no answers, only the growing sense that his life was no longer his own. The land, the warriors, the girl, they had all chosen him. But why? The soft rustle of leaves in the breeze seemed to speak to him, as if the earth itself was calling him to something greater. The light of the setting sun cast long shadows across the path, and as Ethan walked, he found himself lost in thought. His mind wandered back to the moment when he had placed the stone in the rock, the pulse of energy that had filled the air. It was as if the earth itself had responded to his touch, as if he had unlocked something deep within the land. But what was it? And what did it mean for him? As he reached his cabin, he paused, staring at the small structure that had been his home for so many years. It felt different now, as if the walls were no longer just wood and stone, but a part of something much larger. He stepped inside, his boots echoing on the wooden floor, and placed the figurine on the table. The light from the setting sun filtered through the small window, casting a warm glow on the wooden surface. Ethan stared at the figurine, his fingers tracing the intricate carvings. It was beautiful, but it was more than that. It was a symbol, a link to something ancient, something that he had only just begun to understand. He thought back to the girl, her face filled with purpose, her eyes steady and sure. She had known something he didn't, something he needed to understand. Ethan's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of hooves in the distance. He stepped to the window and peered out, his heart skipping a beat. In the fading light, he saw a figure on horseback approaching his cabin. The rider was alone, but there was no mistaking the aura of authority that surrounded him. The warrior leader. Ethan's heart raced as he watched the rider draw closer. The leader's expression was unreadable, but there was no mistaking the weight of the moment. This was no ordinary visit. This was something far more significant. The warrior leader dismounted without a word and walked toward the cabin. Ethan stepped outside to meet him, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to steady himself. The leader's eyes met his, and for a moment, the world seemed to fall away. There was no need for words. Ethan knew what was coming. The leader held out his hand, and Ethan took it without hesitation. A sense of calm washed over him, as if the world had finally aligned. The warrior leader's eyes softened for the briefest moment, and then he spoke. His voice was low and steady, but the words carried weight. Ethan didn't understand all of them, but he understood enough to know that this was a turning point. The leader spoke of the girl, of the bond between them, and of the responsibility that Ethan now carried. It wasn't just about him anymore. He had been chosen for something far greater. As the leader spoke, the weight of the figurine in Ethan's pocket seemed to grow heavier, as if it were a constant reminder of the path he now walked. The warrior leader's words grew clearer, and Ethan began to understand. He had been given a gift, a purpose. The figurine, the mirror, the stone, it was all part of something that transcended him. The warriors had come to honor him, not as a man, but as a symbol. He had been chosen to protect something ancient, something sacred. The leader's voice grew softer, his gaze never leaving Ethan. There was a finality to his words, a sense of duty that Ethan couldn't ignore. This was his fate. He was no longer just a lonely rancher. He was a guardian of something far greater. As the leader turned to leave, Ethan stood there, feeling the weight of the decision settle over him. He knew what he had to do, and he knew that his life would never be the same. The land had chosen him, and now it was time for him to embrace his role in its story. The warriors rode off into the distance, their presence fading with the setting sun. Ethan stood there, watching them go, knowing that his journey was only just beginning. The days that followed were heavy with the knowledge of what Ethan had now become, a guardian of something ancient, something sacred. He spent his time walking the land, feeling its pulse beneath his boots, as if the earth itself was guiding him, teaching him what he needed to know. The cabin that had once been a place of solitude now felt different. It was no longer just his home. It was a sanctuary, a place that held the weight of the world on its weathered walls. The figurine, the stone, the mirror, all of these items had become symbols of his new purpose. Ethan didn't fully understand what it all meant yet, but he knew he was meant to protect something far greater than himself. The warriors had come, they had honored him, and now he was left to make sense of his role in their world. The leader had spoken of responsibility, but what exactly that responsibility was, Ethan could not yet say. He knew the warriors would return, but when? And how? The days passed in quiet reflection, and it wasn't until the fourth morning after their departure that he saw the first sign of them again. At dawn, the unmistakable sound of hooves reached his ears. Ethan's heart leaped in his chest, and he quickly moved outside to see who was coming. Through the morning mist, he saw a lone rider approaching. The figure was tall and steady, and as the rider drew closer, Ethan recognized him, the leader of the warriors. The man's expression was serious, but there was a subtle nod of recognition when he saw Ethan. The leader dismounted with the grace of someone who had done this many times before. His eyes were piercing as they met Ethan's, but this time, there was no tension, no apprehension. Instead, there was something like approval, as if Ethan had passed some silent test. Without a word, the leader motioned for Ethan to follow. The two of them walked side by side toward the clearing where the stone had glowed before, the place where Ethan's journey had begun. The leader did not speak, but Ethan could feel the weight of the moment building. They reached the rock formation, and the leader turned to face him. Ethan stood still, waiting for whatever was to come next. The leader reached into his cloak and pulled out something wrapped in leather. He handed it to Ethan without a word, and Ethan accepted it, his hands trembling slightly. The object was small, the leather worn with age, but it felt heavy in his hands. Ethan unwrapped it carefully, revealing a small bundle. Inside, there was another stone, similar to the one he had placed in the rock before, but this one was different. It had a different feel to it, a different energy. The leader watched him closely as he held the stone, his expression unchanged. Ethan didn't know what to say. What was this? Another test? Another key? The leader spoke at last, his voice deep and steady. Ethan couldn't understand all the words, but the meaning was clear. The stone was a key, just like the first one. It was a key to something else, something deeper. Ethan felt the weight of the leader's words. This was not just about protecting the land. It was about protecting a balance, a connection between the earth and the people. It was about guarding something ancient, something that had existed long before him and would continue long after. The leader gestured toward the rock, then to the horizon, as if telling Ethan that his role was not just here, but everywhere. The warriors were not the only ones who had a stake in this. The land itself had chosen him, and with that choice came a responsibility that could not be ignored. Ethan's heart raced as the leader's words settled in. He understood, though not fully. He knew that this was just the beginning. There would be more to learn, more to do, and he would have to step into the unknown with nothing but his instincts and the tools he had been given. The leader gave him one last look, a look that held a lifetime of knowledge, and then mounted his horse. Without a word, he turned and rode away, his warriors following in perfect formation. Ethan watched them go, the weight of their presence still hanging in the air. The sun was rising higher now, casting long shadows over the land. Ethan stood there for a long time, the stone in his hand, feeling the pulse of the earth beneath him. He had been chosen, and though the path ahead was unclear, he knew one thing for certain. He would walk it, no matter where it led. Days turned into weeks, and Ethan's world began to shift in ways he could never have imagined. The warrior's departure had left a silence in the air, but it was a silence that carried weight. Every moment felt like it was building towards something he still didn't understand but could feel deep within his bones. The stone, the figurine, the girl, they were all pieces of a puzzle he had yet to solve. But there was no mistaking the fact that his life had been forever altered. He spent his days tending to his ranch, but his thoughts were never far from the path ahead. The words of the leader echoed in his mind. the quiet command to protect not just the land, but a balance that existed between his world and the ancient one. Ethan had always known the land was special, but he had never realized just how much it demanded of him. One morning, as Ethan worked in the barn, he heard the faint sound of hooves again. His heart skipped a beat as he looked up, hoping it was the warriors returning. But instead, it was someone he hadn't expected to see. The girl. She was standing at the edge of the clearing, her eyes scanning the horizon, as if searching for something. She hadn't come alone. Behind her, a small group of warriors had appeared, their faces serious, but their presence was not threatening. Ethan's pulse quickened as she stepped forward, her movements graceful yet determined. She was no longer the frightened girl he had first met. She was something else now, stronger, more confident, and carrying herself with the kind of poise that only comes from deep understanding. As she approached, she raised her hand in greeting. Ethan hesitated for a moment before stepping forward to meet her. She smiled softly, the kind of smile that carried the weight of unspoken understanding. Ethan knew that this was a pivotal moment, one that would mark the beginning of something new. "We have been waiting for you," the girl said, her voice calm but filled with purpose. Her words were simple, but they carried meaning that Ethan could feel in the pit of his stomach. He had been waiting for something, too, but what it was, he still didn't know. The girl motioned to the warriors behind her, and they began to form a circle around Ethan. The air seemed to grow thicker, as if the very land was holding its breath. The girl stepped into the circle, and Ethan followed her lead. "You have proven yourself," she said, her eyes meeting his. "You have accepted the responsibility of protecting what is sacred, what is ancient. But now, the time has come for you to understand what it means." Ethan's heart raced as she spoke. He could feel the weight of her words, and yet, he didn't fully understand what she was asking of him. The warriors remained silent, their eyes fixed on him. He knew they were waiting for something, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being tested. The girl stepped closer, her presence filling the space around them. She reached into her cloak and pulled out a small, intricately carved object. It was a pendant, much like the one she had worn the first time they met, but this one was different. It had a symbol etched into it, a symbol that Ethan didn't recognize, but that seemed familiar all the same. She held it out to him, and Ethan took it without question. As soon as his fingers touched the pendant, he felt a rush of warmth spread through his body. It was like a spark had been lit deep inside him, a connection that he couldn't explain. The girl's eyes softened as she watched him. "This is your path," she said softly. "You are more than just a rancher. You are a protector, a guardian of the balance. The land has chosen you, and now, it is time for you to embrace that responsibility." Ethan stood still, the pendant in his hand, the warmth still radiating from it. He looked around at the warriors, their faces expressionless, but their presence was comforting. For the first time, he felt as though he belonged, not just to the land, but to something larger, something ancient. The girl took a step back and motioned for the warriors to lower their weapons. The tension in the air eased, but the weight of the moment still hung heavy. "The warriors will train you," she said. "They will show you what it means to walk the path that you have chosen. But it will not be easy. There will be challenges, and there will be trials. But you must trust in yourself, in the land, and in the balance that has guided you here." Ethan nodded slowly, understanding that this was not the end, but the beginning of a journey he could never have imagined. The girl turned and gestured for the warriors to follow her. As they walked away, Ethan stood there, the pendant still warm in his hand, feeling the pull of the path that lay ahead. The land had chosen him, and now it was time for him to step into a world he had never known, but one that he had always been a part of. The days that followed were filled with both anticipation and trepidation. Ethan knew that the girl's words and the pendant she had given him were not mere symbols. They were the beginning of his true journey. The warriors who had accompanied her remained at his cabin, silently watching him as he adjusted to his new role. They did not speak much, but their presence was constant, their eyes ever watchful. Ethan had always been a man of the land, accustomed to solitude and hard work, but now he found himself at the center of something far greater than anything he had ever known. The weight of responsibility pressed on him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The land had chosen him, and he had to prove that he was worthy of the trust it had placed in him. Each day, the warriors took him deeper into the wilderness, showing him the ways of their people, teaching him how to move silently through the forest, how to track with precision, and how to read the land like a map. They spoke little, but through their actions, Ethan learned more than he ever could have imagined. They showed him the hidden paths, the sacred sites where the earth was connected to the heavens, and the places where the balance between the two was most fragile. Every lesson felt like a key unlocking a door to a world he had never known but had always been part of. As the weeks passed, Ethan's confidence grew. He began to understand the ways of the land and the sacred trust that had been placed in him. But just as he began to feel like he was making progress, something changed. One morning, as Ethan was out with the warriors, a distant sound reached his ears. The unmistakable beat of hooves echoed across the land, growing louder with each passing moment. He turned to look, his heart sinking as he saw a group of riders approaching. They were not the warriors who had trained him. They were strangers, their faces hard and unfamiliar. Ethan's instincts told him that something was wrong. The warriors with him immediately tensed, their hands moving toward their weapons. Ethan's heart raced as the riders drew closer, their presence ominous. The leader of the warriors stepped forward, his expression unreadable as the riders halted in front of them. Ethan could feel the tension in the air, thick with uncertainty. The leader of the warriors exchanged a few words with the strangers, but the language was unfamiliar to Ethan, and he couldn't understand what was being said. The conversation was terse, the air crackling with a sense of danger. Then, without warning, one of the riders dismounted and stepped forward, a menacing grin on his face. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the man, the merchant from the settlement, the one who had been searching for the girl all those weeks ago. The man's eyes locked onto Ethan's, and for a brief moment, Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. The merchant's voice was low, full of malice as he spoke, though Ethan couldn't understand the words. He could feel the threat in the man's tone, the promise of violence that hung in the air like a storm ready to break. The leader of the warriors stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his weapon, his stance unwavering. He spoke with authority, but the merchant only laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that sent shivers down Ethan's spine. It was clear that this was no simple visit. This was a confrontation, one that could not be avoided. The merchant spoke again, his voice rising in anger, and as he did, his men began to dismount, encircling the warriors and Ethan. The tension was palpable, the air thick with hostility. Ethan's mind raced. What had the merchant come for? What did he want with the girl? And why had he come for him now? The warriors stood their ground, there, eyes locked on the approaching riders. Ethan could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the realization that this was the test he had been waiting for, the moment when everything would change. The merchant stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Ethan's. This time, his words were clear, and Ethan understood enough to hear the threat in his voice. He was here to claim what he believed was his, and he would stop at nothing to get it. The warriors, silent and still, seemed to be waiting for something. Ethan stood frozen, his mind spinning with possibilities. He didn't know how to respond, but one thing was certain, he could not allow the merchant to take what was not his. The girl, the land, the balance, he had promised to protect it all. And now, it was time for him to fulfill that promise. The air was thick with tension as Ethan stood among the warriors, facing the merchant and his men. The horses pawed at the ground, the metallic clinking of weapons reverberating through the clearing. Ethan could feel the weight of the situation settle over him like a storm that could either break him or forge him into something new. He had been chosen for a reason, but now, he had to prove it. The merchant stepped forward, his grin never fading, eyes sharp and calculating. His men fanned out around him, each one taking their position with military precision. It was clear that they were used to taking what they wanted, by force if necessary. But Ethan wasn't afraid. He had learned from the warriors, and he knew that fear was something you could choose not to feel. The leader of the warriors stood by Ethan's side, his hand resting on the hilt of his weapon, his expression one of calm readiness. The warriors made no move, but their presence was a silent promise that they would stand with him, no matter what happened next. The merchant's voice broke the silence, dripping with mockery as he addressed Ethan. "You think you can stand against me? You're nothing but a lonely rancher." He sneered, stepping closer, his words laced with contempt. Ethan stood tall, his chest rising with every breath. "I'm more than just a rancher," he said, his voice steady and calm. The words felt powerful coming from his mouth, a quiet affirmation of everything he had learned, everything he had become. The merchant laughed, but it was a hollow laugh, one that didn't reach his eyes. "You've made a mistake, cowboy," he spat, drawing a knife from his belt and twirling it in his hand. "You'll regret this." The warriors moved as one, their eyes focused on the merchant's men, and in that moment, Ethan knew they had already decided the outcome. This was no longer just about him. This was about something much larger: the land, the balance, the trust that had been placed in him. The merchant raised his knife, and for a brief moment, everything seemed to slow down. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, but his hands remained steady. He reached for his own weapon, the weight of it familiar and comforting. The leader of the warriors stepped forward, his movements swift and precise. With one fluid motion, he drew his sword, its edge glinting in the fading light. The merchant hesitated for a fraction of a second, a look of surprise flickering across his face, before he lunged toward Ethan. But before he could take another step, the leader was upon him, their swords clashing with a sound like thunder. The merchant's men hesitated, clearly unsure of what to do. The warriors were a well-trained force, and they knew exactly how to deal with threats. In a matter of moments, the merchant's men were disarmed, their weapons scattered across the ground, and the merchant himself was on his knees, his knife clutched tightly in his hand, but with no way to fight back. Ethan stepped forward, his breath steady, and looked down at the merchant. "You've underestimated the land," he said quietly, "and you've underestimated me." The merchant's eyes flashed with anger, but there was a hint of fear beneath it. He knew, in that moment, that he had lost. The warriors stood around him, their gaze unwavering, and the merchant finally dropped the knife, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Ethan turned away, his heart still racing, but there was no time to dwell on what had just happened. The balance had been maintained, but the battle was far from over. The warriors began to move again, their mission not yet complete. Ethan nodded to the leader, who gave a brief nod in return. "It's not over yet," the leader said, his voice low. "There are others who will come, but we are ready." Ethan felt a surge of pride. This was his path now, and he would walk it, no matter where it led. He had been tested, and he had passed. But there was more to come, and he would be ready. As the warriors began to ride off, their figures fading into the horizon, Ethan stood there, watching them go. He had made his choice, and now he was part of something much larger than himself. The land had chosen him, and he would protect it, no matter what came next.